Some people don't leave your life because of what you did once. They leave because of what you did repeatedly without realizing it. And if the person you're dealing with is an empath, the ending doesn't look like an argument. It looks like silence, a complete disappearance you never saw coming. Have you ever had someone slowly stop replying, stop checking in, stop showing up, and you couldn't figure out exactly when things changed? Stay with me, because what looks like sudden distance is usually something that started long before you noticed. There's a kind of person who will sit with you at 3 in the afternoon on a random Tuesday. Not because something dramatic has happened or the world is falling apart, but simply because they felt something was a little off in a short 2-word message you sent. No long explanations are required. They don't ask for proof or details.
They just show up, as if your silence itself was already a signal. These are the people who remember small things without trying, like the name of your childhood dog or the way your voice changes when you are tired. They notice what others miss completely, and they care in a way that feels almost too deep for this world. They are the kind of people who can cry at commercials about strangers they will never meet, because their emotions do not stay at the surface. They move through life feeling the weight of a room the moment they enter it, as if the atmosphere itself presses against them. They sense tension before words are spoken, and sadness before tears are visible. And then, without warning, one day they are gone. No fight, no dramatic ending, no clear reason that makes sense on the surface. Just a slow, fading presence, like warmth leaving a room you thought would always stay lit. You look around and realize the person who once made everything feel softer has quietly disappeared. There is no loud goodbye, no final argument to point to. It is more like something in them slowly turned off over time until there was nothing left to hold on to. And that is the part most people misunderstand. They assume distance means loss of care, as if love simply shuts off like a switch. But in reality, something very different is happening beneath the surface, something much heavier and more painful than most people ever notice or admit. The truth is, they didn't leave because they stopped caring. They left because caring so deeply was slowly breaking them from the inside. Every emotion they absorbed, every tension they carried that was never theirs, every unspoken feeling they tried to hold for others, it all started building up in ways that became unbearable. And at some point, without even realizing it, the environment around them became too heavy to survive in. So their disappearance was not rejection. It was survival in its quietest form. And often, something in the connection they shared with you, maybe something small, maybe something repeated over time without intention, became part of that emotional overload. Not necessarily because of harm in the obvious sense, but because empaths do not experience relationships lightly. Everything enters them fully. Every tone, every silence, every emotional shift becomes something they carry internally. And when that internal space becomes too crowded, they have no choice but to step away completely, even from the people they once held closest. What people call an empath is not just someone who is kind or sensitive in the usual way. Those words are far too small for what this actually is. Empaths are not just aware of emotions, they absorb them. They do not observe pain from a distance. They feel it as if it is happening inside their own system. Neuroscience gives us a partial explanation for this. Researchers suggest that some individuals may have a highly active mirror neuron system, which is the part of the brain that activates when you see someone else experience something and your body responds as if it is happening to you. In most people, this system helps with understanding others. But in empaths, it seems to operate at a much higher intensity, almost like it has no natural filter. Everything gets in. Nothing passes by unnoticed. This means they don't just interpret emotions, they physically feel them. That is why even small emotional shifts in others can change their internal state without warning. It is not imagination, it is perception happening at a deeper level than most people are aware of. There is also something fascinating that studies on highly sensitive individuals have shown. Many of them have increased activity in the insula, a region of the brain involved in self awareness and processing both personal and external emotions. This means their brains are not only noticing more, but also processing more at the same time. More input, more awareness, more emotional weight being carried simultaneously. It is like having a volume knob for life that is turned slightly too high all the time, making everything more intense than it is for others. So when an empath walks into a room, they are not simply observing it like everyone else might. They are experiencing it. A tense silence is not just noticed, it is felt in their body. Hidden frustration is not just picked up, it is absorbed into their mood. Even unspoken sadness can sit in them without permission. Over time, this constant emotional intake becomes exhausting, not because they are weak, but because they are constantly carrying what was never meant to be carried alone. And that is where the quiet withdrawal begins, not as a decision made in anger, but as a slow response to overload, a natural pulling back from environments, people, or connections that once felt warm, but have become too emotionally heavy to survive in. What looks like disappearance from the outside is actually self-preservation happening in silence, without explanation, because explaining it would require energy they no longer have to give. Empaths are quiet, like weather, not loud or dramatic, but always present in the background of every interaction. You only really notice them when something shifts, like a change in temperature you cannot explain. Now you understand what makes them remarkable. They carry an emotional awareness that most people never fully develop, and they move through life sensing more than they say. But that same quiet depth is exactly what makes them so easy to lose, because what is gentle is often taken for granted, and what is always available is rarely protected. Let's get into the heart of it. These are not dramatic betrayals that push them away. There are no big explosions or obvious breaking points most of the time. It is quieter than that, more invisible, more gradual. And that is exactly what makes it so dangerous. Because when something harmful is silent, it often goes unnoticed until the damage is already done. With empaths, the breaking point is rarely a single moment. It is a slow accumulation of emotional weight that builds up without anyone realizing it is becoming too much to carry. One of the most common patterns is emotional dumping without reciprocity. There is a clear difference between sharing your struggles with someone and treating them like a place where everything gets unloaded without limit. Empaths are naturally magnetic listeners. They don't interrupt, they don't rush you, and they don't make you feel judged. They ask thoughtful questions that make you feel deeply understood, sometimes more than you understand yourself. Because of this, people unconsciously start to pour everything into them without thinking about balance or boundaries. It begins with small conversations, then slowly becomes full emotional dependence. Every crisis, every emotional spiral, every unresolved anger about people, work, or life gets placed on them. Even things from years ago that were never processed properly find their way into their space. And the empath takes it in, not because they are forced to, but because their system naturally absorbs emotional intensity. They rarely say that's enough for today because their empathy does not come with a natural stop signal in the moment. But even though their mind keeps receiving, their body still has limits. There is only so much emotional information a person can hold before it starts affecting their internal stability. When one person is constantly taking emotional release from another without ever asking how they are doing, without creating space for their feelings to exist in the relationship, something begins to shift inside the empath. It is not anger at first. It is quiet withdrawal, a slow emotional distancing that happens without explanation or announcement. They don't usually confront it directly. They don't send long messages explaining what went wrong. They simply begin to become less available. Replies get slower, conversations get shorter, their presence becomes lighter, less anchored, and then one day there is just silence where connection used to be, not because they stopped caring, but because they reached a point where there was nothing left in them that felt safe to keep giving without breaking themselves in the process. Another deeply painful experience for empaths is having their feelings dismissed as too much. This kind of moment leaves a mark that does not easily disappear. Many empaths grow up hearing that they are overly sensitive, that they react too strongly, that they need to toughen up or stop overthinking everything. Over time, this becomes more than just criticism. It turns into an internal belief that something about their emotional depth is wrong or excessive compared to others. So when someone they care about says things like, "Why do you always make everything so intense?" or "You need to stop overthinking," it does more than just hurt in the moment. It activates an old emotional wound. It confirms a fear they have carried for a long time, that maybe they are simply too much for people to handle. And the painful contradiction is that the same emotional depth being criticized is exactly what allowed them to understand, support, and stay present for others in the first place. There is also a more uncomfortable layer to this dynamic. Some people, not always intentionally, begin to use emotional vulnerability in a way that keeps empaths emotionally engaged. They notice patterns. They learn that emotional breakdowns receive attention, that playing the victim creates closeness, that expressing helplessness keeps the empath emotionally present and invested. This does not always come from calculated manipulation, but sometimes from repeated behavior that slowly becomes a learned strategy. Empaths can often sense when something feels off or inauthentic. Their intuition is strong, even when they don't always act on it immediately. The complication is that they genuinely want to believe in people. They want to see growth, honesty, and real connection. That hope can keep them invested far longer than is healthy for them. They give chances not because they are unaware, but because they are hopeful that what they feel underneath the surface is still worth trusting. Eventually, though, there comes a point where the difference between what they sense internally and what they keep trying to believe becomes too large to ignore. The emotional imbalance becomes too obvious to rationalize away. And when that clarity finally arrives, it does not come with confrontation or dramatic closure. It comes with quiet removal. They don't argue endlessly or try to fix what feels fundamentally unstable. They simply step away completely, often without returning. There is also something very real and scientifically recognized behind this experience. Many empaths experience what is known as compassion fatigue, a condition first studied in caregivers, therapists, and healthcare workers who are constantly exposed to the emotional pain of others. Over time, the brain and nervous system become overwhelmed from continuous empathy without sufficient emotional recovery. This is not emotional weakness. It is the natural cost of feeling too much for too long without protection or balance. And one of the most misunderstood aspects of empaths is their need for solitude. It is often misinterpreted as coldness, distance, or emotional withdrawal from relationships. In reality, solitude is how they recover. It is how they separate their own emotions from the emotional residue they have absorbed from others. Without it, they lose clarity about what they are actually feeling versus what they have taken in from everyone around them. When people respond to this need for space with guilt, pressure, or emotional punishment, it creates a harmful cycle. Messages like, "You always disappear when I need you," or passive frustration toward their withdrawal make them feel as if their basic recovery process is wrong. But for them, solitude is not avoidance, it is maintenance. It is how they return to themselves after carrying so much that was never fully theirs to begin with. When this pattern is repeatedly misunderstood or criticized, something shifts permanently. They stop viewing relationships as safe places to return to after rest. Instead, even connection begins to feel like something that drains them faster than it restores them. And once that perception forms, they don't argue about it or try to explain it endlessly. They simply begin to choose distance over repetition of emotional exhaustion. Another often overlooked aspect is appreciation. Empaths rarely demand recognition for what they give. They do not usually keep score or ask for visible gratitude, but they are deeply aware of emotional balance. They notice when their presence, support, and emotional labor are consistently received but rarely acknowledged. Even small gestures of appreciation matter to them more than most people realize, not because they need validation, but because it confirms that their effort is seen. When that acknowledgement is missing for too long, it does not create immediate conflict. Instead, it slowly creates emotional invisibility. They start to feel like what they give is expected rather than valued, and over time, that feeling becomes another quiet reason they begin to step back. Not out of resentment, but out of emotional exhaustion that no longer feels worth repeating in the same environment. They notice when you only call them during moments of crisis. They notice when their birthday quietly passes without the same effort or attention they once gave to yours. They notice when your problems are treated as urgent emergencies, but their struggles are seen as something that can wait, or worse, something that interrupts your life. For an empath, appreciation is not just politeness or good manners. It is not something extra or optional in a relationship. It becomes proof that the connection is mutual, that it exists on both sides with equal emotional reality. Without that sense of balance and recognition, something begins to shift in them internally. They don't usually say it out loud, but they start questioning whether they are truly a person in your life or just a role you rely on when needed. When someone repeatedly receives emotional dependence without emotional return, it slowly changes how they view the relationship. What once felt like connection begins to feel like function, and that realization, even if unspoken, becomes emotionally exhausting for them over time. Before an empath actually leaves your life, something very deep and invisible usually happens that most people never get the chance to see, because it does not happen in arguments or dramatic moments. It happens entirely inside them. They begin to grieve the relationship while still being present in it. That is one of the most painful and misunderstood parts of their emotional experience. While everything on the outside may look normal, inside they are already processing loss. They move through a quiet internal cycle of emotions. At times they feel guilt, questioning whether they are asking for too much or expecting something unfair. They wonder if wanting emotional balance makes them selfish. Then they start making excuses for your behavior, often with a level of patience and understanding that goes far beyond what they are receiving in return. They try to rationalize the imbalance, convincing themselves that things will change or improve with time. During this phase, they often try harder than before. They give more energy, more patience, more understanding, and more emotional availability. Not because things are getting better, but because they are trying to save something they are already beginning to lose. And this continues until a point arrives that is not marked by conflict or confrontation. It is not a loud ending. It is a silent internal shift that cannot be seen from the outside. At some unspoken moment, something inside them closes, not in anger, not in resentment, but in quiet exhaustion. It is like a door slowly shutting without force, without noise, without warning, just a soft internal click that signals something has changed permanently. And the most heartbreaking part is that you do not hear it happen. You continue the relationship unaware that internally they have already started letting go. By the time an empath physically or emotionally leaves, they have already said goodbye many times within themselves. They have already processed the ending in layers long before it becomes visible to anyone else. So when the actual distance appears, it often feels sudden to the other person, even though for the empath, it was a long, gradual process of emotional withdrawal and internal acceptance. It would be unfair to end this without acknowledging something important. Empaths do not function best in relationships where they are constantly overwhelmed, misunderstood, or emotionally used. They thrive in environments where emotional effort is shared, where checking in is mutual and not one-sided, and where their sensitivity is not treated as a weakness or something to fix, but as something real and valuable. They need space that is not punished with guilt. They need communication that is not based only on crisis. They need relationships where silence is not assumed as rejection, but understood as natural recovery. And they need moments where someone genuinely asks them how they are doing, not out of habit, but out of real interest in their inner world. because for them, that kind of presence matters more than perfection ever will. The truth is, when an empath feels emotionally safe in a relationship, something remarkable happens. They do not give less, they give more. Their loyalty becomes deeper, not lighter. Their attention becomes more consistent. Their emotional presence becomes something rare and grounding. They remember small details about you, your fears, your patterns, your vulnerabilities, and they hold them with care that is not easily found elsewhere. People who have experienced this kind of connection often describe it as one of the most meaningful relationships they have ever had, not because it was easy, but because it felt deeply understood. Because being with an empath when the relationship is healthy feels like being fully seen in a way that is hard to forget once you have experienced it. So if an empath has quietly walked away from your life, there is something worth sitting with, not in guilt, but in awareness. Not everything ends because of bad intentions. Sometimes it ends because emotional balance was missing for too long without anyone noticing. And the distance between unintentionally hurting someone and learning how to hold them better is often just awareness that comes too late, or sometimes awareness that comes just in time. And if you are the empath listening to this, there is something equally important to understand. Your exit is not abandonment, it is not cruelty, it is not emotional failure, it is self-preservation. It is your nervous system choosing safety over overload. And even if it feels heavy, that choice is not only valid, it is necessary for your well-being. Because at the end of the day, you cannot stay in spaces where you are constantly giving without being held in return. You cannot continue absorbing emotional weight that was never yours without eventually losing yourself inside it. And stepping away from that is not weakness. It is clarity. It is protection. It is survival in its most honest form. At the end of all of this, what becomes clear is simple. Empaths are not people who feel a little more than others. They are people who experience life through a deeper emotional lens, where everything is felt, absorbed, and carried more intensely than most can understand. This is what makes them so rare, but also what makes them so easily overwhelmed in relationships where emotional balance is missing or never noticed in time. Most of the distance that happens with empaths is not sudden or random. It is the result of long periods of emotional imbalance, unspoken exhaustion, and quiet internal withdrawal that builds up slowly over time. They do not leave because they stop caring. They leave because caring without protection eventually becomes too heavy to sustain. And by the time they step away, it has already been a long process of emotional survival. What is important to understand is that healthy connection with an empath is possible and deeply meaningful. When there is mutual care, emotional awareness, and space for both sides to exist equally in the relationship, they become some of the most loyal, understanding, and emotionally present people you will ever meet. Their depth is not a problem to fix, but something to respect and handle with awareness. And for the empath themselves, the most important truth is this: protecting your emotional well-being is not selfish. Taking space when needed is not abandonment. And stepping away from environments that drain you is not failure, it is self-respect. It is balance. It is the only way to continue giving without losing yourself in the process. In the end, this is not just about relationships. It is about understanding emotional boundaries, recognizing unseen effort, and learning to value the people who feel deeply in a world that often does not.